The unthinkable promise. Forget the moon landing, forget the Apollo program. The most audacious, improbable, and nearly fatal mission in American history took place in 1924, and almost no one remembers it. It was a time when the mere act of flying across the country, say from New York to San Francisco, was a heroic, headline-grabbing stunt, fraught with forced landings, broken propellers, and the constant threat of death. Airplanes were rickety wooden contraptions held together by linen, wire, and a wing and a prayer. The instruments were rudimentary. The air maps were often blank. Yet a small, determined group of U.S. Army aviators, under the leadership of a visionary few, were preparing for a flight that would make a transcontinental journey look like a hop across the street. Their goal was unprecedented, absurd, and intoxicating: to be the first human beings to circumnavigate the Earth by air. This was not just an American adventure, it was a furious, high-stakes international challenge. French, British, Italian, and Argentine pilots were all privately and publicly preparing for the same monumental feat. The nation that succeeded would claim not just a record, but technological supremacy and the defining moral victory in the post-World War I era. In the United States, the plan was born in the austere offices of the fledgling Army Air Service, driven by two men, Major General Mason Patrick, the chief of the Air Service, and his operations officer, Colonel Frank Wham. They were facing a tight budget and deep skepticism from Congress and the public. Fly around the world? Critics scoffed. It's madness, a waste of taxpayer money. They'll drop into the ocean. But Patrick and Lam understood that this flight was more than just a stunt. It was a test of American manufacturing, of pilot skill, of logistical genius, and of a nascent technology they believed would change warfare and commerce forever. Failure was unthinkable, but success would redefine the world's perception of distance and time. They needed the right aircraft. The Flying Coffin, the Douglas World Cruiser. The Air Service turned to a small, ambitious company in Santa Monica, California, the Douglas Aircraft Company, led by the shrewd and driven Donald Douglas. Douglas was given a simple, impossible specification: design an aircraft capable of flying 27,000 miles, crossing 3 oceans, surviving Arctic cold and desert heat, and being easily repairable in the most remote corners of the globe. The result was the Douglas World Cruiser, DWC, a bespoke biplane that looked like a heavy, utilitarian ancestor of modern aircraft. It was a masterpiece of compromise and rugged engineering. Engine: it relied on the reliable, air-cooled 420-horsepower Liberty engine. Structure: primarily wood, but reinforced with steel tubing in critical areas. Innovation: crucially, the DWC was designed to be easily converted from wheels for land takeoffs to floats for water landings. This quick-change capability was essential for crossing the vast Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. 4 planes were commissioned, each given a name that embodied the mission's scope and American ideals: Seattle, the flagship; Chicago; Boston; New Orleans. The names were a subtle, patriotic nod to the nation they represented, flying the American flag into a hostile and skeptical world. The chosen few. The most critical factor, however, was not the planes, but the men. The Air Service needed pilots who were not just skilled aviators, but navigators, mechanics, diplomats, and survivalists, men who could fix a broken engine with a piece of wire and an oath in a Siberian swamp. A crew of 8, 2 men per plane, was selected. They were young, mostly in their late 20s and early 30s, with the kind of unflappable confidence that often borders on arrogance, yet was necessary for the task ahead. The commanders were Major General Frederick L. Martin, flight commander and pilot of the Seattle, a quiet, meticulous planner, known for his relentless attention to detail; Lieutenant Lowell H. Smith, pilot of the Chicago, the charismatic, easygoing Texan, a natural leader with a reputation for cool-headed improvisation in a crisis; Lieutenant Eric H. Nelson, pilot of the New Orleans, a rugged, seasoned flyer, the most mechanically minded of the group, tasked with maintaining the expedition's technical integrity. Lieutenant Lee Wade, pilot of the Boston, the youngest and most exuberant, a brilliant flyer with a dash of recklessness. These men understood the stakes. They were carrying the hopes of an entire nation. Their journey was not mapped in detail, but merely traced on a massive globe in Washington, D.C., a line stretching across oceans, over jungles, and through mountain passes that no plane had ever seen. The route was a logistical nightmare, from the west coast of the USA north to Alaska, across the Bering Strait to Asia, south through the monsoon season of Southeast Asia, across Europe, over the Atlantic, and finally back to the States. The journey would require 23 engine changes and countless changes between floats and wheels. They would be forced to land in places where the nearest radio was 1,000 miles away, where locals had never seen an airplane, and where a mistake meant a cold, unceremonious death. The takeoff, March 17, 1924. The 4 world cruisers were assembled and readied in Santa Monica, California, but the official starting line was set at Sandpoint, Seattle, Washington, a decision made to maximize the distance the planes could cover on the initial leg before encountering the logistical black hole of the Alaskan wilderness. On the morning of March 17, 1924, a vast crowd gathered despite the cold, drizzly weather. The atmosphere was a mix of giddy excitement and palpable anxiety. The mood was captured perfectly by a reporter for the Seattle Times. They are setting out to prove whether the world is truly small enough to be encircled by a machine of man's devising, or if the sea and the wild wastes are still the masters. At 8:45 a.m., the roar of the Liberty engines shattered the morning mist. One by one, the 4 world cruisers, loaded down with spare parts, emergency rations, and 450 gallons of fuel, lumbered down the runway. Seattle, Major Martin and Staff Sergeant Harvey Ogden lifted off. Chicago, Lieutenant Smith and Lieutenant Leslie P. Arnold followed. Boston, Lieutenant Wade and Staff Sergeant Henry H. Ogden next. New Orleans, Lieutenant Nelson and Lieutenant Jack Harding brought up the rear. Their first destination was Prince Rupert, British Columbia, a short hop of 750 miles. The mission was underway. The world waited, skeptical but utterly captivated. The United States had thrown down the gauntlet, and the 4 fragile biplanes were now flying towards the greatest adventure of the era, a feat of exploration that had been dreamed of since the age of sailing ships. The narrative of American ambition was now inscribed not on a flag or a ship, but on the wings of 4 open-cockpit planes. The first leg, however, was merely the overture. The real test, the test of the North Pacific and the Alaskan wilderness, was about to begin. Part 2. The White Hell of Alaska. The first few thousand miles of the global flight, the leg from Seattle up the coast of Canada and into the territory of Alaska, was arguably the most punishing. It was less a flight and more a brutal slog through an unforgiving, unmapped wilderness. The aviators of the 1920s did not have the luxury of modern weather forecasting. They flew into whatever nature threw at them, and in the North Pacific in March and April, nature threw blizzards, blinding fog, and temperatures that could freeze oil in the engine's crankcase. The 4 Douglas world cruisers had been built for endurance, but they were not built for comfort. The cockpits were open, exposing the pilots and mechanics to the elements. They flew bundled in fur-lined leather suits, goggles, and heavy helmets, yet the frigid air cut through the gear, chilling them to the bone. The slightest lapse in concentration, the smallest engine stutter in that desolate expanse, meant a forced landing in a spot where rescue might take weeks or never come at all. The iceberg landing and the first crisis. The original plan called for the world cruisers to be converted from wheels to floats in Seattle, but the logistical support had fallen behind. The planes were still on wheels when they reached the Alaskan Panhandle, a landscape of jagged peaks and deep fjords, leaving almost nowhere safe to land. As the squadron pushed further north toward the isolated Army outpost of Seward, they encountered a relentless low-hanging fog that hugged the mountainsides. Major Martin, the cautious flight commander in the lead ship, the Seattle, insisted on dropping to 100 feet above the water to maintain visibility. On April 6th, near a small fishing village, tragedy nearly struck the Boston. Lieutenant Wade misjudged a crosswind while landing on a narrow strip of frozen beach. The plane bounced violently, smashing its propeller and damaging the undercarriage. They were stranded, but not defeated. The rules of the expedition were strict: no outside assistance for repairs beyond tools and parts. Wade and his mechanic, Sergeant Ogden, worked for 3 days straight in sub-freezing conditions, manually replacing the propeller and improvising repairs with salvaged parts, while the rest of the squadron anxiously waited, burning precious fuel and time. This incident, just 2 weeks into the journey, highlighted the need for mechanical genius over sheer flying skill. The northward grind. When the squadron finally pressed on, they were forced to hopscotch between small, isolated fishing towns and military posts. Chignik, Dutch Harbor, and finally the remote outpost of Attu Island, the last speck of American soil before the vast emptiness of the North Pacific. This leg of the journey was dominated by the terrifying prospect of the 900-mile jump across the Bering Sea to the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia. It was a region where winds could instantly whip up storms and where a successful water landing meant surviving the crushing force of the cold, rolling waves. At Atka Island, they finally switched to floats, a complicated multi-day process involving hoisting the planes and swapping the landing gear, a feat of engineering in a makeshift hangar. Heartbreak, the fall of the flagship. The most devastating moment of the entire circumnavigation occurred as the squadron prepared for the transoceanic leap. On April 30th, the 4 planes departed from Atka Island, heading for the remote port of Nikolsky on Ulanaska Island to refuel for the big jump. Once again, a thick, disorienting fog descended. Major Martin, leading the formation, believed he was flying over the water, but the combination of poor maps and the white-out effect of the fog had tricked his senses. His plane suddenly emerged from the fog right on top of a sharp, uncharted mountainside. Martin reacted instantly, banking hard, but it was too late. The wing clipped the peak. The Seattle pitched violently and plummeted into a deep, snow-filled ravine. The sound was terrifying, recalled Lieutenant Smith of the Chicago, who was flying close behind. One moment Martin was there, the next a great silence. The other 3 planes circled for hours, unable to see anything in the dense fog. They were forced to land and wait out the weather, convinced their commander and his mechanic, Sergeant Ogden, were dead. Survival against all odds. In Washington, D.C., the news was devastating. The flagship of the expedition, the plane carrying the commander, was lost. The mission was immediately deemed a failure by many international observers. However, Major Martin and Sergeant Ogden, due to a miraculous stroke of luck, had survived the crash. The deep, soft snow of the ravine had cushioned their fall. The engine and wing structure had absorbed the impact. They were alive, but utterly isolated, with meager supplies, 100 miles from the nearest settlement, and the plane a write-off. For 10 days, Martin and Ogden battled the Alaskan wilderness. They were starving, frostbitten, and exhausted. They subsisted on small amounts of emergency rations and melted snow, finally managing to walk out of the mountains, following a small stream down to the coast, where they were spotted by a fishing boat. Martin was physically recovered, but his mission was over. The command of the remaining 3 planes, the Chicago, the Boston, and the New Orleans, now fell to the charismatic, quick-thinking Lieutenant Lowell H. Smith, pilot of the Chicago. The mission was now down to 3 planes and 6 men. They had lost their flagship, their commander, and their morale was severely shaken.
The American public was anxious and the international pressure was immense. The world flight had become a saga of attrition. Crossing the Pacific's Gate. Under Smith's newly appointed leadership, the remaining 3 crews pushed off from the Aleutians for the great 1,200-mile leap across the Pacific to the Soviet Union's Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia. It was a region where winds could instantly whip up storms, and where a successful water landing meant surviving the crushing force of the cold, rolling waves. At Atka Island, they finally switched to floats, a complicated multi-day process involving hoisting the planes and swapping the landing gear, a feat of engineering in a makeshift hangar. The leg across the Soviet Union was a blur of challenging diplomacy and difficult terrain. Smith, Wade, and Nelson navigated through a sparsely populated landscape with no airfields, landing in fields and on remote lakes. They encountered the vast, muddy plains of Siberia and finally reached the relative civilization of Japan. In Japan, they were celebrated as heroes. The meticulous Japanese mechanics provided a level of logistical support they hadn't seen since leaving the U.S. They changed the engines, checked every wire and bolt, and prepared the 3 planes for the next phase, the sweltering heat and monsoons of Southeast Asia. They had conquered the Arctic cold, but the next enemy was waiting. Tropical humidity, mechanical fatigue, and the deadly force of the monsoon. They had completed the toughest geographical section, but the longest and most politically fraught leg, the passage through Asia and Europe, was just beginning.